welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Christine, and today's video is going to be a technique video where I'm going to be sharing all of my top tips and exactly how I get this beautiful finish, bias binding finish on our Great Jones jackets. So the Great Jones is my newest sewing pattern, and all of the outer edges are finished with a bias binding. So these actually are techniques that I have borrowed from the quilters. So some of you probably know my mom is a big quilter, and I've made several quilts with her. And through the years of making different quilts, I've gotten to use these binding techniques. And when it came time to make my Great Jones pattern, I was able to pull these techniques into the clothing. And so thanks to the quilters, we have a beautiful binding techniques. So today we're going to be covering how I do the inside seams to get this really beautiful, neat finish. Then we're going to be covering how I do the mitered corners to get that really nice finish on the any of the square corners. And then we're going to be covering a really cool technique that allows you to finish the ends of your binding when you're doing a circle. So pretty much anywhere, the end of the sleeves, and when you're sewing your binding along the front edge, it's one continuous piece. Like you, at some point, you have to take, your side, each side, and form them together. And I have the most mind-blowing technique to get the most neat finish when you connect your two ends that you never even know you're connecting them. It's so cool, and I can't wait to show you. And then at the end, I'm going to show you how I did the tweed jacket finish, which is also a bias binding, but I did a little bit of a hack, and so I'm going to show you how I got that effect as well. Before we dive into the actual technique, I wanted to flip my jacket inside out and show you what the inside looks like of a finished garment so you can understand how we're going to use these techniques. So this is what it looks like from the inside. It's quite cute from the inside, I think. So how we construct this jacket to get the side seams, the sleeve seams, and the shoulder seams is we actually bind the edges as the pieces are flat before we sew anything together. So the very first thing we're doing when we construct this jacket is, as the pieces are laying flat, we're going to do the bias finish along these side seams, each individual. So the back side seam on both sides, the front side seam, and then the sleeves, either side of the sleeve and either side of the shoulders. And then we go ahead and sew the pieces right sides together using that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, just as if the edges were raw cut edges. The seam that is a little different than this is the actual armhole. So how I've done this one is I've actually sewn the sleeve to the garment as normal, and then I've trimmed my seam allowance down to just about 1/4 of an inch, and then I've done the binding just with the sleeve like this. So I put the binding on just like that to cover the sleeve seam. So this is how we do the armhole of the jacket that has a sleeve. Now I'm going to show you how we do the armhole of the vest, which has the little cap sleeve. So what I've gone ahead and done, so what I've done with the vest is before I've sewn on the little flange piece, I've just finished the armhole with the bias binding, just as this, and then I've gone ahead and just put the and then I just slide the vest part under, and I've top stitched it from the top. You can see it's not perfect. But then I top stitched it right over the binding again. So I just slid it under, kind of lined it up, placed some pins, and then went over and top stitched it right along where I had already top stitched for the binding. So that is just an inside look at how these pieces are actually constructed. And now let's get into the binding technique. So I've gone ahead and already cut my 1.5 inch wide bias strips, and I've already seamed them together. So how I like to cut my strips is I use my rotary cutter and mat with a straight edge ruler, and that's how I like to cut my bias strips. But if you don't have a rotary cutter and mat, and I do this sometimes too, is you can just take your straight edge ruler and a water soluble marking pen, and I'll mark out my lines and then go back and cut them with my scissors. So that is a great way to cut your bias strips as well. There's also techniques around on the internet about like making your bias strips in like an assembly line. I don't really do that technique. I just like cut my strips and then seam them together. But instead of seaming them together on like a straight edge like this, I like to seam mine together on the diagonal. And why I like to do this is because it helps distribute the seam in different places. So see how my seam, oh, it's kind of hard to see with the light, but my seam is here and then it goes here. And so none of my seam allowances are directly on top of each other like they would be if I did it on a straight edge. So if you've never done this before, I'm going to show you really quick how I seam my bias strips together. So the first thing you want to make sure is that all your bias strips, at least on one end, have the I think this is a 45-degree angle. So this part is actually cut on the straight of grain, and then this is your bias. So that is the angle I'm looking for. What you want to do is match right sides together, and see on the edges there, I leave, I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm basically lining these up so that right there at the little V here is a 1/4 inch. So they're overlapping by a 1/4 inch. Because what I can do is I can overlap them like this, but I want to just overlap them so my 1/4 inch is just right there where the two pieces meet at the corner there. And then all I'm going to do is just sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So, and you can definitely pin this if you want, but I just kind of slide it under, right about there, and then I sew the seam. I'm using like about a 2.5 inch stitch length, so fairly small stitch length, and I'm not worrying about back stitching because sometimes this can get kind of jammed up in your machine, and we're going to be double sewing this anyways. So don't worry too much about back stitching. And what I actually like to do is I'll just sew all of mine in a line. Like I won't even pull the thread tails. I'll just keep sewing all of my strips together, and that's how I get a lot of them done at once. And then you can see when you open up your strip, we have that diagonal line. And then I'll just go and press this seam open. And if it's a little bit bulky, I can also trim some of the seam allowance away as well, depending on your fabric. This one I probably won't because it's pretty fine fabric and I don't mind that seam allowance there. So that's how we sew all of our strips together. And then once you have all your strips sewn in one long piece, you want to just fold your bias tape in half lengthwise and give it a really good press. So I've already pressed mine, but it's been a couple days, so I'm just going to go back and press it so I have a nice crisp folded edge on my binding. Okay, so now it's time to cover our raw edges. So this is the same technique we're going to use on our side seams and our shoulder seams, as well as all along the front edges, the lower edge of the sleeve. In this example, I'm going to be finishing the entire outer edge of a little vest I'm making. So this is a piece of an old quilt that I actually made a jacket out of, but I had enough scraps to also do a little vest. So I can show you kind of the vest under as well, a little bit clearer here, how I slid this in and then just top stitched right over where my binding was. You can see on the inside. So what I'm going to do is place my binding. My binding has really no right or wrong side anymore. I'm going to place the raw cut edge of my binding matched up with the cut edge, the raw edge of my jacket. And when I'm going to start at kind of the side back. So my side seam is here, this is my back. I'm gonna start just kind of in this area because after we sew part of this on, I'm gonna show you how we're gonna finish this when we get to this side and we have our other side of the binding that we're gonna need to somehow get connected here. So you wanna give yourself like, I don't know, 4 inches, 3 or 4 inches of a tail. So I'll do that and then I'll actually start sewing right here. Before we continue, I wanted to mention a quick point that I didn't make clear just a second ago, and that is that I'm working with the binding sewn to the wrong side of my garment, which seems really counterintuitive, I know. But why we're doing this, so my binding, this is the wrong side of my garment facing up that I'm sewing my binding to. And why we do that is because once we sew this first seam, we're going to wrap our binding around to the right side of our garment, which covers our seam, and then we top stitch from the right side of our garment. And that way we get a really, really nice, beautiful top stitch from the right side. So that's always how we're going to be attaching our binding, no matter if you're working on finishing your side seams before you sew your jacket together, or your shoulder seams, or your sleeve, or the binding all around the outer edges. We're always going to take this first step on with the wrong side of our fabric facing up. So I've just lined them up, and I actually don't pin this, I just kind of sew slowly. So I am going to backstitch when I start my seam, as long as you can, and then I'm just going to sew this with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So as I come in to my first corner, we're going to do the mitered corner technique. So the first thing that I'm going to do is set my machine to stop with the needle down. So that way I'm preparing for my corner. And what I'm going to do is actually stop with my needle down just 1/4 inch away from this cut edge. So I'm going to stop just about there. And I eyeball this. I've done it enough times that I just eyeball it. But you can definitely maybe make a point with an invisible pen. But I'm just going to come right into my corner, and I'm going to stop just 1/4 inch before. There we go, before my edge. So right there. And then I'm going to flip this up, and I'm going to turn everything perpendicular like so. Actually, I think I could sew one more stitch. This is what you get when you eyeball. There we go. And now I'm at 1/4 inch. So this is how I have it now. I just have my binding here extended. I'm going to place my presser foot down again, and I'm going to backstitch off my piece, just like that. And my needle's still stopped down. This is kind of the tricky part, I would say. What I'm gonna do is just first take my binding, pass it underneath here. You can pull this out, if you want. And what I'm gonna first do is take my binding and give myself a 45-degree angle here. So I've just basically pulled this to the back under my presser foot. And it's quite taut with this where my last stitch was right there, that it's nice and taut against that. Now what I'm gonna do is fold it back down. So you can see I have my finger there kind of holding it, but I'm gonna fold it back down and line it up along this cut edge. So it's just there, and then you can see these two edges are lined up. So just like that, if we open it out, we just have this little flipper there, little triangle, double triangle. But what we're gonna do then is just slide it back under our sewing machine at the 1/4 inch, and we're just gonna keep on sewing. We're gonna sew through all the layers. Just like so. And now I think I have enough space to kind of show you. So this is what it looks like as it is now. It's kind of funny looking, but once we turn it to the right side, we're gonna have a nice, neat mitered corner there. And from the front as well, I'm gonna show you how we actually fold this in the front. but that is how we get this really nice mitered corner. So now as I start to come around the top edge and around the back neckline, I'm just, making sure that my binding still stays lined up with the raw edge, but I'm kind of forming it around this slight curve ever so slightly. So you can see I've just kind of stretched it just the tiniest little bit so that it kind of snugs the curve, hugs the curve. So that's how I like to do these soft corners. Okay, so I've gone full circle literally, and I'm coming to the start of my binding. So I'm going to stop just about here. This is about 4 inches. So I leave myself, a nice little space here, and also just to about here, and I'll back stitch. Okie doke. And actually what I'll do is just put my press rivet down so it holds all this in place. So now you can see we've got one edge of our binding where we started here. I'm just gonna lay it flat. Now, one of the measurements we wanna keep in mind as we start this technique, and you definitely wanna have some scissors handy, and you definitely wanna have your measure. This is one thing that I never eyeball. I never ever eyeball, and I eyeball a lot. So make sure you have your measuring device handy. So the measurement we want to keep in mind is the width of our binding, and this is 1.5 inches. So that's the measurement that I want to have in my mind, and I'm just going to smooth out my start of my binding, and then right on top of that I'll smooth over my end of my binding. And then right here to the side, I usually like to take a peek from the side, line up my measuring tape with the start of my binding, and just overlay my other side. And at the 1.5 inch mark, I'm going to cut my upper binding. So just make sure you measure this a couple times, and you can also test this, but I just do it like this. And I'm just going to cut a straight edge. So this is one area where we're not going to cut at the diagonal at this point. And then you can just see it's 1.5 inches overlapping. So we've got our binding cut. Now we need to do our little overlap technique. So the first thing I'm going to do is open out one end of my binding with the right sides out. So you can see I just picked up the binding, put my finger inside, and kind of pull it to the side, right side out. Then I'm going to take the other side of my binding, kind of do the same. I'm going to just fold it open, right side out, and I'm going to line it up like this, perpendicularly with the start of my binding, or the end of my binding. So we'll do it again. This one, right side out, hold it like so. This one, right side facing this, I just line it up like this. Just line up you kind of want to square this, so just trying to do this while having the camera. So I guess one way you can see that you're doing it the correct way, let me just see if I can put that there, is check out your fold lines. So this fold line is going up and down, and this fold line is going left to right. So that's how you can make sure you're doing it right. The other thing I like to do to make sure I'm doing this right is place a pin. So we are going to be sewing this at a diagonal. So I've got this, and I actually do this without any pins. What I would do then is I would just push this back under my sewing machine, and I would sew from here to here. So I sew a diagonal here. But what I'm going to do to show you first is just, I'm going to pin where we're going to sew. So I place a pin there and place a pin on this corner. So we're literally just sewing this corner to corner, just like so. So I would sew right where my pins are, starting from here all the way to there. And then this is how you can test it just to make sure you're doing it right. Because then once you sew the seam, you trim away your excess, and your binding magically is the correct size and it lays flat. It is so cool. So let's, now I've confirmed that I've done it right. So now I can sew this seam. So it's a little tricky to get in there. That's why you leave yourself, you know, a little bit of a tail on either end. And we're just gonna pop this in. And to be honest, this doesn't, I mean, you do want to be exact as you can with this, but you know, it's also a little bit forgiving because it is on the bias. So you can also mark a sewing line here if you wanted. And I do just give it maybe one or two little back stitches there. Sorry, the camera. So this is what it looks like now that I've stitched it. This was our up and down one, and this one is our left to right one sewn together. And it's gonna lay perfectly flat. So now I can just cut away this extra. I don't cut until I've tested it to make sure I have it right. Just trim that away. You can kind of finger press your seam open, or you can give it a press before you continue. I usually just give it a finger press and then fold it kind of back where it should be. Look at that. It is the perfect size, and you never know where your binding started or finished, because then we're just gonna put this back under our machine and just continue sewing our binding on. I'll do my back stitch. There we go. And voila. This is where we connected our binding. And then we're going to, when we place this over to the right side, you never even know where your binding started and stopped. It is the coolest technique. I'm so glad I got to show you this. Once I have my binding all sewn on, I just like to kind of go around, and at any points where there's a little bit hanging over the 1/4 inch seam line, I just like to kind of trim it away. And then I also trim just a bit of bulk from our corner. So I don't cut any of the stitching, but I'm just gonna come in here and just trim maybe down to about 1/8 of an inch off of that corner. That's just gonna help us turn this corner really nice and smoothly with just slightly less bulk. Then I'm going to take my jacket to the ironing board, and I'm going to press this binding away from my garment.
There is a life I lead in this city, hurrying to cut my teeth. I can take what I need to get by. It doesn't make it easy. The other piece of my heart.
Okay, so I have my binding all pressed nicely away from the wrong side. So now we're ready to flip the binding over to the right side of our garment, finally. So I've already started kind of pinning in my binding, but all you're gonna do is just wrap it from the wrong side over to the right side. And I love using these little 1/2 inch clips. These work really well for quilt binding or for this binding. You could also use pins. You can also just wing it and not use anything at all. I've definitely done that as well. But it's kind of nice to do the clips for a really, just to make sure you have a nice, neat finish. And also when it comes to our corners. So this is the last part of the technique that I need to show you. So from the wrong side, this is how our binding looks. So I've just pressed my binding away, and this is how our corner looks at the moment. So then what I'm going to do is just kind of start folding my binding around to the right side. And one of the things, it's a little bit of a trick that you want to look out for, is which way your miter is going. So the bulk of my miter is actually on this side. And so on the front side, I want the bulk of my miter to go the other way, if that makes sense. It's a really tiny little trick, but it does help your corner lay a little bit flatter, and the miter just kind of forms neater. So, so what I'm going to do, this is the right side of my garment, just start folding my binding and fold it flat. So we're recreating the miter once again. So just do that, and then I just fold the other side down, and it's slow overlapping a little bit. So what that tells me, see how the corner isn't matching up perfectly? I like my corners perfect, and it's possible to get it perfect. So I just kind of refold it again, and then I'm just gonna like really just hold my spot there, and voila, I got it. I got it. Okay. So you can just kind of work with it a little bit until you get the right look that you want. And then I like to just put a little clip in the corner to hold it in place. And then I'm ready to take this to my machine and top stitch. So I obviously top stitch from the right side of my garment, and I just stitch right along that the folded edge here of our binding and secure it down. And that's all there is to it. So you literally can't even see where we started and stopped our binding. It gives you such a clean finish. And I wanted to mention too, if this is something that you want to practice maybe before you start your jacket, making little coasters. I actually have these that I made, some I made, some my mom made in Seattle. And these are a great place to practice this technique, because you can practice the corners, you can practice the end, the in around, like the end part on these, and the top stitching and everything. And they're not, it's not a full jacket. So they're a really great place to practice. If you want to practice this technique, maybe give it a try. So now I'm going to show you the incredibly simple technique that I did in order to get this really cool tweed fringe, kind of Chanel inspired effect on my tweed jacket that I made. So this is incredibly simple. It's so much more simple than the last technique we just did. And it still involves your bias strips, but you're gonna cut them just a little bit wider than the other technique. So on this one, I think I used 2.5-inch wide bias strips. I sewed them together all in a round, or all in a continuous strip like we did before. And all I did was then press my strips in half. So I had a nice edge, nice folded edge. And then I literally just, like if this is my jacket, I just then put the strip around my jacket just like that. And I sewed it down through all the layers at just about 1/2 inch from this edge. So just about here. You can play with it, how far in you do. Maybe you want to do a wider strip or a more narrow strip, however you'd like to do it. The width really is for you to decide, but I sewed it down, and then I just pulled out the threads to get to get this kind of the tweed unraveling effect. And with the tweed, I didn't do the in the round technique for finishing the overlap edges of the tweed. The nature of it really lends itself to blending very, very well. I think I can't even find where I did the overlap. I think it's here. So you really can't even see where you overlap the tweed. So my recommendation is just to overlap them and sew it down well, and you'll be just fine with the tweed finish. So if you have any questions about this technique or the previous binding technique, definitely drop them below. I'm really excited to share this, and so excited for you to try it as well. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. And if you're interested in checking out the Great Jones pattern, you can do so on my website at sewinginthecity.com. And I forgot to mention my sweatshirt. This is actually my Sullivan sweatshirt. It's one of my sweatshirt patterns. I'm a little bit linty because I'm wearing black, working with tweed and batting and whatnot. I'm so excited for you to try this. I hope that you love the finish as much as I do. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.